So I'd been debating whether or not I wanted to make a part 2 to the Palpatine video, or rather or not I wanted to acknowledge and talk about the events of Dark Empire. For those of you who don't know, Dark Empire was a comic series that was later made into an audiobook, which is how I read it, I guess you could say, which takes place immediately post-Thrawn. And in it, Palpatine comes back from the dead, having transferred his essence to a clone on the deep core world of Biss. So, due to kind of the strangeness of it, resurrecting an old villain, and just kind of some of the questionable plot elements in Dark Empire, I wasn't sure if it was within Palpatine's character or really should be considered when talking about him. However, I've been reading a bit more about it. I've been reading the book Thrawn, and just since then I played some more of the Old Republic and I learned a bit more about Bitchute, and it kind of put the whole thing in a bit more context. So this is a part 2 of the Palpatine character profile, and this deals with the events of post-Endor, Operation Shadowhand, and Dark Empire. So I guess just to kind of recap, one of the key takeaways I had in the first video was the way Palpatine had built his empire. It was entirely 100% dependent upon him. There was no source of power, no source of legitimacy, no real command structure independent of his supreme autocratic will. Under Palpatine, you had the Imperial Ruling Council, or as I like to call them, the Imperial Rule Association after the Japanese One Party state of World War II. And they consisted largely of sociopaths, sycophants, incompetents, bootlickers. Palpatine, generally speaking, showed a preference for people who were blindly loyal, were corrupt, were sociopathic, or had no power bases of their own, because they were less of a threat to him. So generally speaking, within the Imperial Ruling Council, which ran the Galactic Empire more or less, all the members of it were constantly backstabbing. They would have mini wars. They would amass their own fleets. And in general, none of them were particularly skilled or competent leaders. In fact, skilled or competent leaders were often killed in Palpatine's Galactic Empire, or were not promoted to top positions of authority, Thrawn being one of the few notable exceptions. But yeah, generally speaking, these people were regarded as threats, and Palpatine viewed, as long as he had his dark side powers, and as long as there was so much infighting between the other factions that there was no real legitimate challenges to his rule, then things would work out. So what happened immediately after Palpatine died is Vader died at the same time, and Grand Moff Tarkin had died during the Battle of Yavin, which eliminated really the only top 3 plausible leaders of the Empire. If Palpatine had have died and Vader was still around, Vader probably could have taken over. Vader really had no desire to ever run the Empire, nor do I think he would have been a competent leader, but I think he would have commanded enough fear, particularly if Executor had have survived, that he would have been able to seize the title of Emperor. Likewise, Tarkin was one of the few people who was promoted based on merit, and he probably could have done a fine job as Emperor, and people would have allied to him. However, when Palpatine died, there was no clear successor. Instead, you had some of the most powerful people in the Empire vying for control. Immediately after his death, the Imperial Ruling Council declared itself the heir to Palpatine and kind of set up an oligarchy on Coruscant. They were driven off and kind of executed by Isard, who was the head of Imperial Intelligence. Isard was literally bipolar, sociopath megalomaniac who was in love with Palpatine. Yeah. And she was an attractive woman, too. It's not like she was some old hag who was in love with him. But she had a sexual attraction to him because she admired his power and how he was an even bigger sociopath than she was. So she kicked out the Imperial ruling council and basically made herself empress. But she was extremely incompetent, and she wound up losing Coruscant and just completely fucking up. So after she died, she had, no, not died, but went into exile and in hiding. The Imperial Rule Council, the ones she hadn't killed, also scattered, although they continued to claim to be the Imperial government. After that, we had Zrinji, I don't know how you pronounce his name, but he was a captain or an admiral, I'm not exactly sure, of a super star destroyer. And he was more or less the most competent Imperial commander left aside from Thrawn. And he managed to set himself up as the Grand Warlord and control roughly half of the galaxy. He was killed, though, by Han Solo. After Han Solo attached himself to the bottom of the Super Star Destroyer before it took off. And because of the way shields work, if you're inside the shield doesn't do anything. So he was able to blow up the Super Star Destroyer. So after his death, you had no clear leader. There was no one left, really, who had the ability to rule the Empire. Isard was able to dominate briefly because she controlled Imperial intelligence, and Zinji was a genius strategist and was able to win military victories. He also happened to get lucky and have a couple Super Star Destroyers lying around. But after his death, what you had left was a bunch of Grand Admirals, a bunch of Admirals, and a bunch of Moffs and Grand Moffs, all of which, because of the nature of the Empire, had their own battle fleets. So they almost immediately, the First Imperial Civil War started, and they began just killing each other and just wiping each other out. And this was kind of by design, because so long as there wasn't a real rival to the Empire, any number of civil wars didn't particularly matter to Palpatine. He could always stop them whenever he wanted to, because enough of the remaining forces would remain loyal. But as there was no real central government anymore, the Empire was completely incapable of doing anything about the rebellion, now the New Republic. Because I think most people who've seen Return of the Jedi go, well, how is the Empire going to lose? I mean, Palpatine's dead, but there was still a fleet of hundreds of Star Destroyers, and the rebels only had a couple dozen ships. Well, what happened is virtually all of the Imperial resources were lost during the war, the Civil War, and as they destroyed each other, the Republic would just conquer devastated systems. So, in the aftermath of that, you have the return of Thrawn, and when Thrawn comes back, Thrawn being one of the very few people to ever be promoted based on merit and not being a sycophant, I think what a lot of people don't realize about Thrawn is virtually none of the Imperial warlords gave him any soldiers. He came back with basically his own fleet from the unknown regions, and a couple other warlords gave him some troops, but he only had a couple dozen Imperial-class Star Destroyers at any time. The vast majority of the Empire gave him no backing, and the fact that he was able to basically bring the New Republic to its knees was a testament to his strategic genius and not the size of his forces. So then, Thrawn eventually died, and he was kind of the last hope of an Imperial resurgence. He was kind of... You have Palpatine, Vader, and Tarkin gone, and Thrawn was kind of the fourth member who was competent enough and was a man of vision. Now, I personally believe, because otherwise Thrawn's death is literally the lamest thing in all of Star Wars, that Palpatine was involved with Thrawn's death. That somehow the Noghri commandos, or that whole thing, was manipulated by Palpatine to kill his sole remaining rival. So, we're getting into the actual Palpatine thing. I think the background was kind of important to deal with the fallout of Palpatine's reign and kind of the deep flaws with how he built the Empire and how it was incapable of surviving in any form after his death. Now, the Imperial Rule Council had backed Thrawn, and while they really hadn't played any role in his victories, the fact that Thrawn was theoretically winning in their name gave them a lot of prestige. So they were able to reunite basically all of the Imperial warlords for a direct assault on Coruscant. So something like, I think, 8 Star Dreadnoughts, hundreds of Imperial Star Destroyers, and a large portion of the remaining Imperial troops just attacked Coruscant, and they basically annihilated the entire New Republic's navy. The New Republic had to abandon dozens of worlds and basically go back into hiding, showing that with any degree of unity, the Empire could have reestablished itself. So after they retook Coruscant, the question came that they had to elect a new emperor. So we enter into a six-sided civil war where Imperial intelligence, the Commission for the Preservation of the New Order, the Army, the Navy, and the remaining Sith adepts waged a total war over the skies of Coruscant. And keep in mind, probably like 70-80% of the remaining Imperial forces were there. I think they lost like half a dozen Star Dreadnoughts. Like Super Star Destroyers rammed into each other. You had hundreds of Star Destroyers shooting each other at close range. You had the majority of the remaining Imperial like land army kill each other off. And this went on for months. Just imagine this. Like dozens of field armies and fleets just annihilating each other. And it was kind of revealed at this point that the whole thing had been orchestrated by Palpatine. So we're going to get into Palpatine now. So after the events of Endor, Palpatine had, on the deep core planet of Biss, a number of clones made. So once his original body died, he transferred his mind from his original body into a clone body, which was able to hold his essence, and he basically came back to life. Now, this is something that was widely practiced by the Sith of old, in particular Emperor Bitchute, who had gone through hundreds or thousands of bodies. I think he lived like 10,000 years ultimately. The thing is, though, as with all dark side powers, there's a very steep cost. Generally speaking, in Star Wars, Sith are much stronger than Jedi. Even the Sith apprentices could often fight full Jedi Knights. If you look at the Old Republic, it's online, it's pretty clear that Sith are much stronger on average. That's because the dark side is stronger than the light side in absolute terms. Also because the Sith practice of natural selection means that only the strongest Sith will survive. The problem with the dark side is like a drug. The more you use it, the more it degrades you mentally and physically. That's why Sith get sallow, pale skin. Their bodies basically start to fall apart. They get yellow eyes. Palpatine is hideously disfigured from his abuse of the dark side. It also rots your mind pretty rapidly. So essence transfer is pretty much one of the ultimate dark side powers. So when Palpatine transferred his essence, his already corrupted consciousness had to endure the stress of flying across the galaxy and inhabiting a new body, as well as basically existing as an entirely non-physical dark side entity. So it destroyed what was left of his sanity, and he basically abandoned all of the pragmatism that had brought him to power. There's a passage I read about Napoleon once, and I'm trying to remember how it is. I think it was post-Russia or post one of his campaigns. It said, by this point, the highs of Napoleon's career were behind him, as were his best battles. And from now on, he would rely on overwhelming force and brutal battles of attrition to gain victories. And this is kind of what had happened with Palpatine. All his great achievements, all of his cunning plans, all of his pragmatism was behind him. He had basically gone insane with power because he had literally died and come back to life. And from this point on, he basically, his megalomania kind of reached its zenith. The Sith have always been very skeptical about the use of normal soldiers and normal ships. A lot of them believe that you should rely on the dark side alone, and that having non-force users is a weakness. The Jedi have normally accepted the need to have armies composed of basically normies, whereas the Sith have always favored total mediocrity, where non-force users are basically slaves to force users. And this was kind of the ideology that Palpatine adapted. He believed there was no more need for superweapons or even ships and armies in general, and that in the future all wars would be fought directly with the dark side. Keep in mind, Palpatine was so strong he could summon 4 storms that could destroy entire fleets by himself. And he foresaw having thousands of dark side adepts that could pull ships apart with their minds and pacify entire planets with the power of the dark side. And he saw the remaining Imperial Navy as something to be used up and discarded. So, because of his insanity and his basic desire to return to the old ways, eliminate, re-enslave basically all non-Force users, and restore the old Sith Empire, he actually encouraged the Imperial Civil War on Coruscant. He used the dark side and his own agents to keep it going longer and to make it reach greater heights of destruction. He believed that the Civil War would eliminate the impure and eliminate the weak, and what would be left would be the most ambitious, most evil, and most cruel. And with this pure army, he could destroy all opponents and establish his dark empire run solely by Force users. Essentially, at one point, even after the majority of the Imperial forces had been destroyed in the Civil War, he revealed himself publicly and called all of them to the deep core planet of Biss. From there, he launched Operation Shadowhand, which was an all-out assault on all fronts against the Republic and the warlords. Palpatine succeeded in basically annihilating what forces the Republic had left, and the Republic completely abandoned all of its remaining planets and went underground, becoming the rebellion once again. During this time, Palpatine turned back to large and practical superweapons, such as the World Devastators and the Eclipse-class Super Star Destroyers, building bigger and bigger stuff. It's interesting, though, because his super weapons were undermined once again by his obsession with the Force. He wanted to corrupt Luke and make Luke his apprentice, to replace Vader, and to that end he was willing to do pretty much anything. Luke initially faked becoming his apprentice and used the opportunity to shut down the World Devastators and basically completely fuck up the military campaign. Palpatine didn't really care. Another example of Palpatine's over-reliance on the Force is, despite using the Super Star Destroyer Eclipse, he didn't actually use the super laser or the guns on it, and he just tried to destroy a Republic fleet by using Force Storm, and it backfired and blew his own capital ship up, which I think the Eclipse class is 700,000 crew members. That's an irreplaceable amount of resources, not only in constructing it, because you can rebuild ships, but of experience, kind of the cream of the crop of the Imperial Navy, which could have crewed dozens of Imperial-class Star Destroyers. But it was lost completely by his own stupidity. And then he went back to another clone body, his second, and as time went on, and he kept transferring clone bodies, he just became more and more crazy and more paranoid, and the losses from Operation Shadowhand kept mounting. Even though they were winning, Palpatine opted to just devastate entire planets, commit multiple genocides, and there was just gross mismanagement. The internal fighting continued. And it was basically like the Empire had been previously, but with Palpatine being more directly involved and completely giving in to his sadistic tendencies. So things had gotten so bad that the Imperial Rule Council decided that he had to be stopped. So they got Palpatine's private physician to destroy the remaining clone bodies. So Palpatine was on his last clone, and there was no unaltered sample of his DNA to create another. And it says something that the Empire would have preferred losing a war to constant civil war than to have Palpatine back. That's how crazy he had gone and how megalomaniacal he was. Ultimately, his death came when he tried to transfer his essence into I think was it Jason Solo or Ben Solo? Either one. One of Leia and Han's children he tried to transfer his essence into, but he screwed that up and died a final death as the Eclipse 2 Biss and his super weapon, the Galaxy Gun, were destroyed once again because of his own megalomania, as he died his final death. So ultimately, I think Palpatine kind of represents the best and worst aspects of the dark side. On one hand, I think he was unarguably the most powerful character in Star Wars. While Luke and Vader probably possessed more raw force potential, Palpatine was probably more learned and had studied more about the Force than any other character. He had mastered a number of abilities. He was a master lightsaber duelist, as well as one of the best pure Force users the galaxy had ever seen. He was also a man of near limitless genius, and probably with the exception of Thrawn, was one of the smartest, if not the smartest, characters to appear in a Star Wars book. Despite all of that, though, Palpatine suffered from victory sickness. He had basically won everything his entire life. If you read the book Plagueis, Palpatine had even killed someone when he was recklessly driving a speeder bike and had gotten off because of his privileged upbringing. He faced very little in the way of setbacks or even real hardship, and he had succeeded basically in doing what no Sith had ever done. He completely conquered the galaxy. He utterly destroyed the Jedi Order, and he had fulfilled Darth Bane's rule of two. So despite all of that, because of all of that, he justifiably held a very high opinion of himself. The opinion, though, went from justifiable confidence to complete arrogance to utter insanity. And that's kind of what led to his second downfall. Even though he really should have been able to easily crush and destroy the New Republic, and his own arrogance and stupidity once again led to his downfall. I think what it was is he had succeeded in wiping out the Jedi Order, in winning a galactic civil war twice, and basically ruling as the supreme autocrat of the galaxy with very little opposition for over a decade. He believed himself to be completely above material concerns. He had so frequently completely trounced his real-world rivals, he had moved completely into the realm of the mind and had forgotten basically all about the things that were actually required for leadership. It's kind of interesting because in Palpatine's second phase, he abandoned his ideas about order, he abandoned his ideas about minimalism, etc. The New Order was barely even mentioned. The New Order was meant largely for non-Force users. His Dark Empire would be a government entirely by Force users, which understandably didn't appeal to virtually anybody in the Empire. I think a lot of people didn't even believe he was back because he was so different than he had been when he was alive. So much like Bitchute in the past, all of his former victories and former successes were completely behind him, and he had been reduced to a shadow of the man who had brought down the Galactic Republic. So I think whatever the lameness was, it does, I think, represent the ultimate failings of the dark side of the Force, as well as the ultimate failings of his personality, and serves as kind of a useful analog or mirror to Darth Vitiate's similar downfall. So I hope you enjoyed the video. More stuff to come. I'll talk to you later.